up, y'all? It's your boy Coffee Kid back with another episode of The Observation. It's a blessing to be here again. I got an interesting clip to react to, something I came across when I was on Instagram. Short clip. I don't know the title of the full interview on YouTube, but I do know it's a conversation between someone who's a New York divorce lawyer who is talking with a couple other gentlemen about this prioritization of the self in our current American context. And I don't think it's just the American context. I think in this modern era of Western cultural behavior, this prioritization of the self that is put before all other things and has developed into something I think that is farther than we could have ever imagined our society coming to. And so I think he posits some great ideas, some interesting observations that I want to react to and tie back to scripture, because I think he's 100% onto something. I think he is without a doubt hovering across a grave reality of the human condition and hovering across prophecy already given to us in scripture as to how humans and how we would operate in the last days, where the tendencies of our heart as humans will move towards if we continue to put the self above all things, if we esteem the self above all things. And so we'll tie that back to scripture. What does scripture already say about some of those observations that he's making about our current society? And so I think it's a fascinating conversation. Again, it's a New York divorce lawyer who's reflecting on some of his experience and observations within our social and cultural behaviors.
Why do you think people are so drawn to it then?
Because we jam it down their throats. Are you kidding me? Why do people do it? Because what's in front of you all the time? Open your Instagram right now. Yeah. It's just cleavage and money. That's all it is, endlessly, over and over again. And it's become this intertwined cycle of value, where it's like, well, if I have a beautiful woman, she has value. And if she's with a high value man, then she's valuable. So she has to maintain a certain level and I have to maintain a certain level of wealth. And it's all like late capitalism. It's all what happens when you just don't believe in anything and you don't have anything underlying there's no principle. And again, I don't think it has to be God. Maybe that's heretical of me to say. I don't think it has to be. I think it just has to be, there has to be some common dream. There has to be some thing that brings us all together, something bigger than the self. Like we have spent, since I grew up, since the 70s and 80s, everything was the self-esteem curriculum. Everything was self-esteem. You could be president. You could be amazing. What do we esteem other than the self now? What do we esteem other than the self? Money? Money's just an expression of the self. Beauty? It's part of the self. Celebrity? It's the ultimate expression of the self. So what do we esteem other than self? That's what's interesting to me. In your culture, whatever culture it is, when you say you have self-esteem, of course you have self-esteem. Of course I like me. What a shocking thing to say, how controversial that you like yourself. That's like saying, I think my kid is cute. It's not shocking that you think your kid is cute. What's interesting to me is, what do you esteem other than self?
So why do you think people are so drawn to it then?
Because
I mean, I think like I said, he's definitely hovering around the truth. What is our foundation outside of our own esteem? What do we esteem outside of ourselves? And the reality of it is, because everyone uniquely has their own self-esteem, it's just a bunch of people prioritizing their self, and when you multiply that by 8 billion, there's naturally going to be conflict, there's naturally going to be division, there's naturally going to be cutthroat behavior, there's naturally going to be selfishness, there's naturally going to be a lack of compassion, and in this endless cycle of validation, self-validation, which it's ironic that we want to self-validate, but we depend on the validation of others to validate the self. But how can we depend on others if the trend is increasingly everyone else is just worried about their self? Again, it's naturally going to clash, it's naturally going to conflict. And he says, look, we have to define and esteem something outside of ourselves. It doesn't have to be God. But who defines what that is? Who defines this existential true north that this guy, looks like his name is Carl Lentz, is saying needs, or James Sexton is saying on what needs to happen for us to avoid overvaluing the self, right? Because it's not that we are tearing down the self. It's not that we're saying, oh, the human and the self-esteem is not valuable, because according to the scripture, we are uniquely made in the image of God, and so we do have a value. But where do we assign our worship? Where do we assign our care and the desires of our heart? Is our self on the throne of our own conscience? Or do we esteem and allow something beyond ourselves to sit on the throne of our hearts? And he's saying it doesn't have to be God, but in my opinion, if it's not God, what is it? If it is some existential idea, consciousness, whatever that we're allowing to sit on the throne, if it's not objective, then we might as well not even have the conversation, because we're just doing what we are already calling out, this overvaluing of the self. Because if we define what sits on that throne that's beyond the self-esteem, it's basically just our own preferences and whatever has built up in our consciousness and whatever we prefer. And so I think you can't have the conversation without venturing into God and without venturing into an all just, all righteous, omniscient being who knows all things and has a divine understanding and divine wisdom and divine plan for what should sit on the throne of our hearts and who should sit on the throne of our hearts, which would hypothetically be God. So I think you can't have the conversation without venturing to God, and that's why it's no surprise that he references it. But I think it's a very striking observation that he's making, and something that is honestly very rare in a lot of schools of thoughts. Not to take away from mental health and the reality that self-esteem is absolutely necessary for a productive society and productive individuals, but where does it lie in the rank of importance? Where does it fit contextually into our own self-behavior and our own ambitions? And so with that being said, I'm going to transfer into scripture just to tie back to this idea of self-image and self-gratification that becomes this endless cultural cycle of need and want for validation. So we'll start 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. So it reads, "But mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power." So, when Timothy writes this, he's making a very similar observation to what this lawyer is making. People will be lovers of themselves, and being lovers of themselves will bear these evil fruits, these destructive fruits that will permeate the society in these last days and will lead to a denial of truth. So what he's saying is not necessarily a new idea. Again, this is a constant theme that scripture has already covered and warned and prophesied about. If you, for example here, if you love yourself too much, what ailments will risk your world and your reality? So that's one example. James 3:16. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and every evil practice. So when we have selfish ambition, where we put ourself and our own desires at the center of our being and on the throne of our hearts, disorder and evil will follow. That's why we have this cyclical pattern of self-validation that leads to people fearing rejection, that leads to people not recognizing what real love is, that leads to people defining love in a transactional way rather than a way that is sacrificial. So those trends exist in our current society and in many ways probably always existed, but they will continue to be in existence in a disorderly way if selfish ambition prevails. If the cultural school of thought is self, according to James and Timothy, we will find a plethora of disorder as a consequence. And let's take it back to Solomon. If we want to go back to ancient texts, more ancient than the New Testament, let's dive into Ecclesiastes. You have Solomon, who's this king, this wise king who has everything he could ever want, who comes from a place of no lack. He's documenting his pursuit of wisdom, his pursuit and his observation of the life before him while he's living in this supreme situation of power and money and riches. So Ecclesiastes, written by King Solomon, that's the context. Chapter 2, starting at verse 10, says, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. So starting at verse 10, you see Solomon giving you the reality and giving you the background that, hey, he put himself at the center. He didn't deny himself anything his heart wanted while putting himself at the center in this self-absorbed disposition that he allowed himself intentionally to take on so as to observe what it did for him and what it meant in the broader scheme of life. So verse 10, we see a king, experimenting with this idea of putting the self at the center. But in verse 11, he says, yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Nothing was gained. He put himself at the center. He denied himself nothing. His self-esteem sat on the throne of his heart, yet nothing was gained under the sun. He could not ascertain a meaning to all that he had achieved by the strength of his own hands. What did all those achievements and gain afford him? Ultimately, he couldn't ascertain. It was meaningless. Not that it didn't matter, but it was impossible to grasp the meaning of it because ultimately he had the same fate as the poor man. He had the same fate as the fool. So all of these things ended up being meaningless. When we put our self at the center and on the throne of our heart, we're chasing after the wind. We're chasing nothing. We're floating around in life with ideas of gratification, ideas of self-fulfillment, but we leave empty. And at the end of Ecclesiastes, Solomon, he makes the claim that all these things, he tried wealth, he tried pleasure, he tried participating in infrastructure building and all of these things. And his main conclusion was, at the end of the day, all that is meaningless. The only conclusion is fear God. And so I think from scripture, we see a tie back to what this lawyer is starting to observe, that there must be something outside of the self that we esteem. So with that being said, it's been another episode of The Observation. Let me know your thoughts, your comments on this, because it intersects with a lot of different schools of thoughts. It intersects with psychology and therapy, this idea that, the self is important and you don't want to despair, but how do you balance it? And it intersects with religion, obviously, and these spiritual matters. But then it permeates our culture. The reality is, people have always been selfish, but I think it's different in our current society. The speed and the rate and the dynamics at which people seek to please themselves is, I think, a lot more rapid than it ever has been with the technology and the platforms that are out there, and the way our society and our generations interact with each other. So again, it's been another episode of The Observation. It's your boy Coffee Kid. I hope this was relevant. I hope it was insightful. Like, comment, subscribe, and have a blessed day, evening, wherever you're at, whenever you're watching this. Peace.